April 6th, 1945, 15,000 feet above the East China Sea. The air inside the cockpit of the Mitsubishi A6M0 was thick with the scent of oil, gasoline, and the faint, metallic tang of his own fear. Sub-Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka gripped the control stick, his knuckles white against the worn leather. Below him, the vast, indifferent blue of the ocean was dotted with the unmistakable silhouettes of the American fleet, the steel teeth of an industrial monster chewing its way toward his homeland. His target was a destroyer, one of the smaller ships on the outer radar picket line, a lonely sentinel guarding the main carrier groups. His mission, his entire existence, had been distilled into this single, final act. For months, he and his comrades had trained for this moment. They were the Tokotai, the Special Attack Corps, a weapon born of desperation, and forged in the fires of an ancient warrior code. They were the Divine Wind, the Kamikaze, and they were Japan's last, best hope. Tanaka knew exactly what to expect. He had studied the American tactics, memorized the placement of their anti-aircraft guns. He anticipated the streams of 20mm and 40mm cannon fire that would reach up for him like fiery claws. He had trained to jink and weave, to use the sun and clouds, to become an unpredictable spectre of vengeance. The Americans, his instructors had assured him, fought like machines. They were predictable. Their tactics were based on mathematics and brute force, a wall of metal thrown into the sky that a skilled pilot with sufficient spirit could penetrate. His spirit, the pure, unyielding spirit of Yamato, would be his shield. He would guide his 250-kilogram bomb through that storm of steel and bury it in the heart of the American ship, trading his life for a victory that would echo through eternity. He pushed the stick forward, the Zero's engine screaming as he began his terminal dive. The world narrowed to the American destroyer, growing larger in his sights. He saw the flashes on its deck as the gunners began to fire. Here it comes, he thought, the test. But then, something impossible happened. Something he and his instructors had never expected. Long before his aircraft entered the effective range of the ship's smaller cannons, the air around him began to explode. Not on the ship, not from shells whizzing past him, but in empty space. A series of black, greasy puffs of smoke erupted in the sky, seemingly at random, creating a lethal, invisible wall. One moment, his wingman was flying off his starboard side, a disciplined shadow against the blue. The next, a black flower of flak bloomed 100 feet in front of the man's propeller. The Zero didn't just get hit, it was consumed, disintegrating into a cloud of aluminum confetti without a single tracer shell having touched it. Tanaka was stunned. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It defied the laws of physics, the logic of warfare. There was no sound, just a sudden, violent concussion that slammed his own plane, followed by another and another. He yanked the stick, trying to evade. But how do you evade an enemy who can detonate his shells in mid-air? It was as if the Americans weren't just shooting at him, but were commanding the very atmosphere around him to turn against him. The sky itself had become their weapon. He had been prepared to die in a storm of steel. He was not prepared to be swatted from the heavens by magic. To understand the chilling disbelief in that cockpit, you have to understand the strategic reality of 1944. The Empire of Japan was being systematically, brutally dismantled. The American island-hopping campaign across the Pacific had been an unstoppable juggernaut. From Guadalcanal to Tarawa, from Saipan to Iwo Jima, each battle was a step closer to the Japanese homeland, each victory secured by a tidal wave of American industrial might. Japanese garrisons, taught to fight to the last man, were annihilated by naval bombardments, overwhelming air power, and legions of Marines armed with weapons their own country could no longer produce in sufficient numbers. By late 1944, with the capture of the Mariana Islands, the Americans had unleashed a new kind of hell, the B-29 superfortress. These silver giants flew from airfields on Saipan and Tinian, soaring at altitudes Japanese fighters could barely reach, and began the systematic firebombing of Japan's cities. The homeland, once considered inviolable, was now burning. The Japanese military leadership, facing total collapse, was shocked by the speed and ferocity of the American advance. They had never known an enemy could project so much power across such vast distances. Their own industrial base was crumbling. Oil imports had been choked off by American submarines, steel was scarce, and skilled factory workers were being conscripted to fight in hopeless battles. In this crucible of desperation, a new, terrifying doctrine was born. Vice Admiral Takejiro Nishi, observing the disastrous air battles over the Philippines, concluded that conventional attacks were no longer viable. Japanese pilots, while brave, were increasingly inexperienced, flying outdated aircraft against superior American planes like the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair. He proposed the unthinkable, organized suicide attacks. The strategy was codenamed Tokotai, and its pilots would become known to the world as the Kamikaze. The logic, from the Japanese perspective, was brutal but sound. A conventional pilot had a slim chance of scoring a hit on a maneuvering warship, and an even slimmer chance of returning home. A kamikaze pilot, however, had only one objective. By turning the entire aircraft into a guided missile, the probability of a devastating hit increased exponentially. They laughed at the American notion of self-preservation. One pilot for one warship. In the grim arithmetic of attrition, it seemed like a worthy trade. These were not simply untrained men thrown into obsolete planes. The first kamikaze pilots were often highly skilled veterans, chosen to demonstrate the effectiveness of the tactic. They were indoctrinated in a modernized version of the ancient samurai code of Bushido, which emphasized honor, duty, and a willingness to die for the emperor. The pilots would perform ceremonies, writing farewell letters to their families and receiving a ceremonial sip of sake before their final mission. They saw themselves as spiritual warriors, their sacrifice a pure and noble act that would save their nation. They truly believed their spirit could triumph over the soulless, material advantage of the United States. What they never expected was to be confronted by a weapon that was not just a product of material advantage, but of a scientific and intellectual superiority that seemed almost supernatural. In the early days of the kamikaze attacks in the Philippines in late 1944, the tactic proved horrifyingly effective. The USS Street Low, an escort carrier, was struck by a single zero and sank in less than half an hour, killing over 100 American sailors. The sight of Japanese planes deliberately crashing into their ships sent a wave of shock through the US Navy. The sailors were surprised not just by the tactic, but by the fanaticism behind it. Conventional anti-aircraft gunnery was designed to shoot down an enemy who wanted to live, an enemy who would break off an attack when damaged. But the kamikaze was different. He would keep coming, even with his plane on fire and riddled with holes. The only way to stop him was to completely destroy the aircraft in the air. This new threat demanded a new solution. The standard anti-aircraft strategy relied on filling a patch of sky with as much shrapnel and explosives as possible. Gunners on American warships used two primary methods. First was direct fire from 20mm Oerlikon and 40mm Bofors cannons, which required immense skill to lead a fast-moving target. Second were the larger 5-inch guns, which fired shells equipped with mechanical time fuses. A gunnery officer would calculate the target's speed, altitude, and range, and set a timer on the shell to explode after a certain number of seconds, hopefully in the vicinity of the aircraft. This was an incredibly difficult art. A tiny miscalculation in speed, a sudden change in the target's direction, and the shell would explode harmlessly in empty air, hundreds of feet from its intended victim. Against a conventional bomber formation flying straight and level, it was moderately effective. Against a single, diving kamikaze, the odds of a direct hit or a lucky detonation were perilously low. For every 10,000 5-inch rounds fired, the US Navy was lucky to score a single kill. The Japanese pilots knew this. They had studied the American system and knew its weaknesses. They expected a sky filled with shells, but they believed they could fly through the gaps. Then, during the invasion of Okinawa in the spring of 1945, the equation changed completely. The battle, codenamed Operation Iceberg, would be the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War and the site of the most intense kamikaze attacks. The Japanese launched over 1,900 suicide missions in a series of massed attacks called kikusui, or floating chrysanthemums. To protect the main fleet, the US Navy established a ring of radar picket stations often consisting of one or two destroyers positioned far from the main force to provide early warning of incoming raids. These ships were the most exposed, the sacrificial lambs, and they bore the full, terrifying brunt of the divine wind. But these lonely destroyers were now armed with something new, a weapon that had been developed in the utmost secrecy, a technological miracle that Japanese intelligence never knew existed. It was officially designated the VT Fuze, with VT standing for variable time. To the sailors who used it, it was simply the Proximity Fuze, or more affectionately, the Magic Fuse. And to the Kamikaze pilots who faced it, it was an instrument of inexplicable terror. The Proximity Fuze was, without exaggeration, one of the most important technological innovations of the entire war. It was a miniature Doppler radar set, no bigger than a light bulb, screwed into the nose of a standard 5-inch anti-aircraft shell. The device contained a delicate radio transmitter and receiver powered by a small battery that was only activated by the immense G-forces of being fired from a cannon. Once in the air, the fuse began emitting a continuous radio wave. When a target, like an airplane, entered this cone of radio energy, some of the signal would reflect off the aircraft's metal body and bounce back to the receiver in the fuse. As the shell closed the distance to the target, the frequency of the returning signal would increase, a phenomenon known as the Doppler effect. The sensitive electronics inside the fuse were designed to measure this change. When the reflected signal reached a specific, pre-calculated strength indicating the shell was within a 70-foot kill radius of the target, it triggered an electronic switch, detonating the 55 pounds of high explosive in the shell. The result was a perfectly timed explosion, a perfectly placed cloud of lethal shrapnel, without ever needing to touch the target. It completely eliminated the need for precise timer settings, guesswork, or a direct hit. The shell knew, with electronic certainty, when it was close enough to guarantee a kill. The development of this weapon was an American triumph of science and industry, second only to the Manhattan Project in its complexity and secrecy. Led by the physicist Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, the project brought together the nation's brightest scientific minds. The challenge was immense: to build a radio set rugged enough to survive being fired from a gun at 20,000 times the force of gravity and spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute. Early prototypes were made with glass vacuum tubes that shattered instantly upon firing. The team had to invent entirely new, robust components, miniature marvels of engineering that could withstand the unholy violence of a cannon blast. By 1942, they had a working model, and production began under a veil of secrecy. Companies with experience in electronics, like Crosley, RCA, and Sylvania, were enlisted to mass-produce the fuses. Thousands of American workers, many of them women who had entered the workforce for the first time, meticulously assembled the complex devices, unaware of their ultimate purpose. They only knew they were working on Project X. By 1945, American industry was producing 40,000 of these magic fuses every single day. When these shells first arrived in the Pacific Fleet, their effect was immediate and astonishing. During early tests, gunnery crews were stunned as target drones, which normally took hundreds of rounds to bring down, were obliterated by the first or second salvo. The kill probability of a 5-inch gun leaped from less than 1% to nearly 50% against maneuvering targets. A single destroyer, which previously might have struggled to fend off a handful of attackers, could now erect a nearly impenetrable shield of electronically triggered explosions. The symbol of this new American power was the black puff of smoke. For Japanese pilots, that simple, ugly smudge in the sky became a harbinger of a death they could not comprehend. Their comrades would be flying straight and true one moment, and the next, their plane would be ripped apart by shrapnel from a shell that had detonated impossibly far away. They couldn't believe their eyes. Their reports, from the few who survived, were filled with confusion. They described an invisible barrier, a ghost wall that shredded their formations. Some pilots, their minds struggling to process the impossible, believed the Americans had developed some form of flaming rocket or a new kind of aerial mine. They had no conceptual framework for a weapon so advanced. On April 16, 1945, this technological gap was demonstrated in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The destroyer USS Laffey, on station at Radar Picket Station 1, endured one of the most concentrated kamikaze attacks of the entire war. For 80 minutes, the Laffey was assaulted by 22 Japanese suicide planes. The ship's 5-inch guns, equipped with the Proximity Fuze, were a whirlwind of defensive fire. The gunners no longer had to worry about setting timers. They just had to get the shells into the same general patch of sky as the enemy. The fuses did the rest. Again and again, attacking Japanese planes were vaporized by the magic shells, but the sheer number of attackers was overwhelming. Despite shooting down 9 kamikazes, the Laffey was struck by 4 bombs and hit by 6 suicide planes. By the end of the assault, the ship was a burning wreck, its rudder jammed, fires raging across its decks. Yet, it refused to sink. The ship survived, a testament to the courage of its crew and the incredible durability of American shipbuilding. But the story of the Laffey also highlights the horrifying effectiveness of the VT Fuze. Without it, the ship would have been hit not by 6, but likely by 15 or more kamikazes, and would have been blown to pieces in the first few minutes of the attack. The psychological impact on the Japanese pilots was devastating. The kamikaze strategy was predicated on the idea that spiritual purity and willpower could overcome a material disadvantage. It was a contest of the human spirit against the enemy's machine. But the Proximity Fuze wasn't a machine they could fight. It was an invisible, omniscient intelligence that rendered their skill, their courage, and their sacrifice irrelevant. It was profoundly demoralizing. Imagine being a pilot, having said goodbye to your family, sworn an oath to die for your emperor, only to be killed by an anonymous puff of smoke generated by a machine you never saw, or technology you never knew existed. It removed the warrior's contest from the equation. It was no longer a battle. It was an execution, carried out with cold electronic efficiency. The Americans, they had been taught to see as decadent, soft, and lacking in fighting spirit, had produced a weapon that seemed to belong to the gods. They were shocked to discover that the nation of cars and movies was also a nation of scientists and engineers capable of producing a weapon that bordered on sorcery. The contrast between the two nations' scientific and industrial capabilities was laid bare by this single piece of technology. While Japanese industry struggled to produce basic aircraft, American factories were churning out not only tens of thousands of superior fighters and bombers, but also millions of these incredibly complex miniature radar sets. Each fuse was a testament to America's deep reserves of scientific knowledge, its precision manufacturing capabilities, and its logistical genius in distributing these secret weapons to its fleet across thousands of miles of ocean. The kamikaze pilots had been told they were fighting a soulless giant. They laughed at the idea that such a comfortable nation could endure a brutal war, until they met the Proximity Fuze. Then they understood. They were not fighting a soulless giant. They were fighting a brilliant one, a giant that could not only build more ships, more planes, and more guns, but could also build smarter ones. The black puff of smoke from a VT Fuze shell became the ultimate symbol of this realization. It was the physical manifestation of a technological and intellectual gap that no amount of courage or spiritual devotion could ever hope to bridge. Each puff of smoke was a punctuation mark at the end of a Japanese pilot's life, a declaration that the age of the samurai was over, and the age of American technological supremacy had begun. This transformation in the skies was the direct result of a weapon the Japanese high command couldn't believe was real, even after its effects became undeniable. The Americans had not, in fact, mastered magic. They had mastered radio electronics. The weapon was the Mark 53 VT Fuze, a device so revolutionary that Admiral Lewis L. Strauss, a future chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, would later claim it was second only to the atomic bomb in its importance to Allied victory. Its journey from a theoretical concept to a war-winning weapon is a story of American ingenuity and industrial power that the Japanese military, with its focus on martial spirit, had completely failed to anticipate. While Japanese strategists were busy calculating the spiritual value of a pilot's sacrifice, American scientists were calculating radio frequencies and circuit loads. They were fighting two completely different kinds of war, and one was about to render the other obsolete. The sheer scale of the American Fuze program was staggering. It represented a fundamental difference in philosophy. The Japanese approach to a problem was often to demand more from the individual, more spirit, more sacrifice, more willingness to die. The American approach was to build a better machine. By the end of the war, the United States had produced over 22 million proximity fuses. The program cost over $1 billion in 1,940 seconds currency, an astronomical sum that rivaled the Manhattan Project in its early stages. It was a national effort. While the scientists at Johns Hopkins and the Applied Physics Laboratory provided the brains, the muscle came from the factory floors of Middle America. Women, who a few years earlier had been homemakers or shop assistants, were now assembling some of the most advanced electronics on the planet. They worked with tweezers and soldering irons, meticulously putting together the 130 individual components that made up each fuse, a task requiring immense dexterity and focus. This was a secret army of technicians, their work as vital to the war effort as any Marine hitting the beaches of Okinawa. This industrial avalanche was something the Japanese leadership simply could not comprehend. They had laughed at America's consumer culture, believing it had made the nation weak, until they were confronted with the reality that the same industrial base that could produce millions of automobiles and radios could pivot to produce millions of microscopic radar sets with terrifying speed and efficiency. Japan's own electronics industry was comparatively primitive. They struggled to produce reliable aircraft radios, let alone a device as sophisticated as the VT Fuze. They had been beaten not just on the battlefield, but in the laboratory and on the assembly line. The strategic surprise was total. By the time the Japanese realized they were facing a new type of weapon, it was already present in overwhelming numbers. There was no time to develop a countermeasure, no way to reverse engineer a technology they barely understood. They were trapped in a technological checkmate. On the decks of the American destroyers, the sailors themselves were initially surprised by the fuse's incredible effectiveness. A gunnery officer on the USS Compton wrote in his after-action report from Okinawa, "It was unbelievable. We were seeing splashes in the air where there shouldn't have been any. Planes were coming apart at ranges we considered impossible. At first, we thought it was a fluke, a lucky hit. After the third or fourth time, we knew we had something new. It gave the men a confidence we hadn't had before. For the first time, it felt like we had a real shield against the kamikazes." This newfound confidence spread throughout the fleet. The 5-inch gun crews, once engaged in a desperate and often futile race against time, now operated with a cold, professional precision. Their job was no longer to score a 1 in 1,000 direct hit, but simply to place a shell in a 3-dimensional box of space around the target. The fuse handled the rest. Official US Navy analysis concluded that the Proximity Fuze was 7 times more effective against attacking aircraft than timed fuses. It effectively multiplied the fleet's defensive firepower overnight without adding a single new gun. This new capability completely changed the dynamics of naval air defense. Before the Fuze, the best defense was a layered system, with carrier-based fighters forming the outer screen and ships sailing in tight formations for mutual fire support. The Proximity Fuze turned every 5-inch gun-equipped ship, even a lone destroyer on a picket station, into a lethal fortress. These picket ships, once considered the most vulnerable points in the fleet's armor, now became its most hardened bastions. They were the tripwire, and now the tripwire was electrified. Japanese reconnaissance planes would report the location of these isolated destroyers, and the kamikaze leaders would dispatch entire waves of aircraft to eliminate them, believing them to be easy prey. They never knew they were sending their pilots into the most effective anti-aircraft traps ever conceived. One destroyer, like the USS Cassin Young, could put up a wall of flak so dense and so intelligently detonated that it could annihilate an entire squadron of attackers before they ever got close enough to see the details of the ship. Faced with this inexplicable slaughter, the Japanese High Command was thrown into confusion. Their pilots' reports were filled with tales of an enemy that could command the air to explode. They struggled to find a solution. First, they tried changing their tactics. Believing the new weapon was some kind of altitude-dependent shell, they ordered their pilots to come in low, skimming the waves to try and fly under the flak ceiling. This was a deadly mistake. It made them easy targets for the 40mm Bofors guns that lined the rails of every American ship, and it silhouetted them perfectly against the water for the 5-inch gunners. Worse, the VT Fuze worked just as well at low altitude. Radio waves reflected off the sea surface, sometimes even enhancing the fuse's sensitivity. When that failed, they tried saturation. Instead of sending small groups, they launched the massive Kikusui raids, hoping that by sending 100 planes at once, a few would inevitably get through. While this did lead to some successes, like the damage to the Laffy, the exchange rate was ruinous. Japan was losing hundreds of pilots and aircraft to destroy a handful of ships, many of which, like the Laffy, were damaged but not sunk. It was a strategy of national suicide, and the VT Fuze was accelerating the process. The most profound impact, however, was on the morale of the Kamikaze pilots themselves. Their entire philosophy was built on a trade, their life for a warship. The nobility of their sacrifice was rooted in its potential for success. The Proximity Fuze poisoned this belief. It introduced an element of random, impersonal death that stripped the act of its perceived glory. A pilot could follow his training perfectly, display immense courage, and fly with a pure spirit, only to be obliterated by an unseen force miles from his target. His sacrifice became meaningless, his life extinguished not in a blaze of glory against the enemy's hull, but by a brief, anonymous puff of smoke. The letters home from these pilots began to change. While still filled with patriotic fervour, undertones of a new, technological fatalism began to appear. They were no longer just fighting American sailors, they were fighting American science, and they knew, deep down, it was a battle they could not win. The black puff of smoke, the symbol of the VT Fuze, became a symbol of their own, impending, and perhaps pointless, doom. It was the calling card of a nation that didn't just outfight them or outproduce them, but could outthink them, turning the very sky they flew in into a weapon against which their spirit offered no defense. The terrible truth that dawned on the Japanese high command in the final months of the war was that they had fundamentally misjudged their enemy. Their propaganda had painted Americans as soft, materialistic individualists who would shrink from a brutal, bloody conflict. They believed the American spirit was weak, and that a sufficient display of Japanese willpower and sacrifice would cause them to lose their nerve and sue for peace. The Kamikaze was the ultimate expression of this belief. It was a weapon designed to attack the American psyche as much as its warships, but they were shocked to discover that the Americans didn't counter their spiritual weapon with one of their own. They countered it with physics. They met fanaticism with ingenuity. The Japanese had brought a sword to a gunfight, and the Americans had brought a gun that could think. This intellectual and cultural gap was perhaps the most significant factor in Japan's defeat. The nation that had given the world the assembly line and the light bulb had turned its innovative genius to warfare with a focus and scale that no one, least of all the Japanese, had ever expected. The VT Fuze was a product of a society that valued collaboration, scientific inquiry, and systems-based problem-solving. It was conceived by scientists, funded by a forward-thinking government, engineered by corporate labs, and mass-produced by a skilled civilian workforce. It was the ultimate systems weapon, a triumph of the American way of life as much as the American way of war. In contrast, the Japanese military was a rigid, siloed institution, rife with inter-service rivalry and a general disdain for civilian scientific input. Their response to a failing strategy was not to innovate, but to double down on the existing doctrine, demanding ever greater sacrifices from their young men. They couldn't believe that their warrior ethos, cultivated over 1,000 years, could be so completely nullified by a small electronic device. The black puff of smoke, once a mysterious terror, now became the clear and undeniable symbol of this gap. It was the symbol of an impersonal, industrial war that rendered individual bravery moot. A kamikaze pilot could be the most courageous warrior in the history of Japan, but his courage meant nothing to a radio wave traveling at the speed of light. That black puff was a technological curtain he could not pierce. It represented a new kind of battlefield, one where the decisive blows were struck not by men in cockpits, but by men in lab coats a year earlier and 10,000 miles away. For the American sailors, it was a symbol of hope, a sign that their country's ingenuity was protecting them. For the Japanese pilots, it was a symbol of utter despair, the final proof that their gods had abandoned them and that their sacrifice, however noble in their own eyes, was strategically futile. The final statistics of the Battle of Okinawa tell the brutal story. The Japanese expended nearly 2,000 kamikaze aircraft during the campaign, While they managed to sink around 36 Allied ships, mostly destroyers and smaller craft, and damage hundreds more, the cost was catastrophic. They lost thousands of pilots, men who represented the last vestiges of their trained air crews, and thousands of aircraft they could never replace. The American fleet, though bloodied, was never in danger of breaking. Its industrial base could replace lost ships and crews with an ease the Japanese could only dream of. The proximity fuse was the crucial variable that ensured the exchange rate would always be in America's favor. It didn't stop every kamikaze, but it stopped enough of them to make the strategy unsustainable. It turned a potentially devastating tactic into a desperate and ultimately failed gamble. It bled the last of Japan's air power dry and left the homeland utterly defenseless against the final B-29 raids and the looming threat of invasion. In the end, the story of the kamikaze and the proximity fuse is the story of two worlds colliding. One world, steeped in ancient traditions of honor and sacrifice, believed the human spirit was the ultimate weapon. It sent its sons to die with poems in their pockets and the name of their emperor on their lips, their final act a dramatic, personal statement of defiance. The other world, built on principles of science and mass production, believed the ultimate weapon was a better idea. It sent its sons to war protected by armor plate, radar screens, and shells that could think. This world didn't ask its men to die in glorious charges. It built machines to do the killing for them, efficiently and from a safe distance. The kamikaze pilot, in his final, terrifying dive, never heard the sound of the shell that killed him. He never saw the American gunner who fired it. His war ended in a silent, electronic transaction he never knew was taking place. There was no final contest of will, no dramatic showdown between warriors. There was only the cold, hard logic of physics, executed by a miniature radio in the nose of a shell. The divine wind had blown with all its furious might, but it had broken against an invisible wall of American ingenuity, a wall symbolized by a simple, black puff of smoke.